On Mondays, I join an online Bible study with some clergy colleagues from around the diocese about the readings for the coming Sunday. So we share our questions and learn from each other, and I always get insights from my colleagues. And this week I logged on and found my friend Kira, who is the associate at St. Mary the Virgin up in San Francisco. And while we were waiting for others to join, I decided to pick her brain about how her church handled all the instances in the Gospel of John, which we have been reading a lot in this lectionary cycle, when John says, "the Jews." You may have noticed me stumbling over it if you've been here on Sundays recently. I stumble over it, or I try to rephrase it to varying degrees of success when I stand here and proclaim the gospel. The problem is that it sounds harsh or even hostile the way that it's written. And for centuries, these passages have been misused to justify anti-Semitism. Frustratingly, there isn't a simple fix for how to translate it differently, because John doesn't only mean one thing by the word that he's using in Greek. Sometimes he meant the Judeans, who were people from Judea as opposed to from Galilee. Other times, he's referring to the temple authorities who felt threatened by Jesus' message of radical inclusion.
Yep, those brickheads.
And sometimes it reveals the growing rift between Christians and Jews in the early church. So some newer translations of the Bible put the word more accurately in context, so it sounds less like a blanket ethnic condemnation. But the current translation authorized for Episcopal worship, and therefore in the book that we read from, is not one of those, not yet. So that means that when I come up here on Sunday, I have to be ready to proclaim the gospel and maybe make an adjustment for you to make sure that the way that what John is saying is clear. To clarify that context for you when I read. Because here at Holy Family, where our mission is to be an inclusive community sharing God's love, where we share our space with the Kosai Jewish community. Here is their ark for the Torah right here behind me. And where we welcome interfaith families, we do not want to reinforce, even a little bit, religious language that has inspired hatred or violence. Long before I joined Holy Family, you have prioritized inclusive language, shifting away from a view of God as a patriarch, exercising dominion. This is why our current bulletin refers to the Spirit as her in our affirmation of faith, and swaps almighty for all loving in some places, and uses God instead of Lord, moving away from titles associated with earthly hierarchies, like feudalism or monarchy. Ironically, while we are avoiding the title Lord today, Peter's use of it in the Pentecost sermon that we hear in our reading from Acts was radically defiant of those very same power structures in his day. In the Roman Empire, a lord was an owner of property and people, a title reserved for the emperor. And by giving that imperial title to a carpenter executed for treason, Peter was publicly challenging Rome's authority, standing in the middle of occupied Jerusalem, literally surrounded by Roman guards and buildings the Romans had erected. It was a public challenge to imperial authority, a declaration to the Jewish crowd that their religious authorities chose the wrong Lord when they aligned with Rome to execute Jesus. In the Roman Empire, calling Jesus Lord was radical. But in 2026, many spiritual seekers long for different metaphors to describe God. Because we have seen how kings and lords and sometimes even elected leaders abuse power. Holy Family's practice of expansive language strives for what the British theologian Sarah Maitland calls a big enough God. A conception of the divine that is vast and joyful and expansive enough to embrace the staggering complexity of the universe, rather than a small, restrictive deity limited by our historically narrow imagination. God has always been stretching our imagination, trying to help us see the grandeur of God's purposes, the beauty and joy of an abundant creation where justice rolls forth like a mighty river, touching all people and allowing the earth to flourish. But in the course of our ordinary lives and the pragmatism of what it takes to get things done, our focus often narrows, and our imagination is restricted to what seems reasonable, possible, and useful to our immediate community of care. I know that as a person who is always trying to accomplish more work than I have time for, that I often settle for good enough, and I rarely invite God's Spirit to stretch my vision with big, hairy, audacious goals. Thankfully, God does not give up on us. God continues to reveal God's self in new ways, helping us to see that all along, God's loving presence has been so much more than we first imagined. On Pentecost, God came to the disciples as the Spirit, giving them the gift of languages and the mission to spread the good news. God revealed that just as God told Abraham long before, the blessing of God is for all the nations of the world. What happened that day was rooted in the symbolism of the biblical stories, from creation, the burning bush, and the Tower of Babel. And yet it was something completely new and unexpected, bigger, joyful, and irresistible to 3,000 more people who got baptized. 50 days before Pentecost, on the very evening of Easter, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking on the road to Emmaus. A man appears to them, and they call him a stranger, a term translated more accurately as a migrant or a resident foreigner. He is the one whose death they grieve. Yet their sadness has narrowed their vision, their imagination. They cannot see who is right in front of them. And they dismissively label him an uninformed immigrant. But there is a revelation here for us that is poignant. God incarnate chose to reveal himself as a marginalized, migrant outsider. This story helps us understand the gospel's inclusiveness, helps us understand God's particular solidarity with people that our government is targeting right now. And that solidarity is deeply rooted in the biblical tradition and the imperative to care for the stranger. I love the story of the road to Emmaus. It's so important for our understanding of the Eucharist and what it means to be church. It's one of the stories that I taught my New Testament 7th grade students when I was a school chaplain. And because in that class, we had a lot of religious diversity, we always talked about a range of ways to interpret Bible stories. And so I would ask them if this story of the road to Emmaus is better if you interpret it literally or symbolically. Does this story pack more theological and spiritual punch if the literal resurrected Jesus appeared to Cleopas and the friend? Or is it actually more powerful if it's a symbolic story? If it's in the table fellowship and breaking bread with an outsider, a migrant, that the disciples see Jesus in another person. And when they realize that that is what "do this in remembrance of me" means, they run out the door back to Jerusalem to proclaim the resurrection. Jesus is alive in us and between us. Either way, literal or symbolic, our imagination is opened. It's stretched through this new revelation. Jewish New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine says that this story shows us something vital about revelation. God reveals God's self through fellowship meals and table sharing, rather than through Bible study, theological understanding, or even a direct vision of Jesus, which they experienced out on the road to no effect. He explained everything to them, and they still didn't get it until they broke the bread. As that beautiful communion hymn says, the disciples knew Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And that's how we know Jesus too. We meet the risen Jesus in each other, not just in sharing communion bread, but at coffee hour, at fellowship lunches, or tea with a friend. We meet Jesus when buying groceries for Coastside Hope's food pantry, or marching to uphold human rights and dignity. It happens when we share a meal or a conversation with someone whose personal story stretches our imagination to understand that God is even bigger and more expansive than we realized. God continues to reveal God's self to us here and out in the world. And if we pay attention to that revelation, it's not only our theological language that evolves. We are able to respond to God's invitations. We are able to grow. And we are better able to see God revealed in others. If we keep journeying with our big enough God in life-giving ways, we find hope. We become more inclusive, And we participate in the ways that God is transforming the world beyond our wildest imagination.